In this demo, I want to get you familiar with some of the extra things that a collection view source can do for you when working with data-bound collections, specifically sorting, filtering, and grouping. Starting point here is the end of our last demo working with data grids. I'm going to take my data grid and pull it down from the top a little bit so that I have room to add some buttons. I'm going to drop into the UI here and add a button. Its content is set to sort, and we're going to hook up a onSort method in the code behind. Our onSort handler here, you can see, is going to reach out and find that customer's view source that's up in the XAML. This is the one that was generated through drag and drop and slightly modified in the last demo, but it's pointing to the customer's collection exposed from the window code behind, which is our data context. So once we have a reference to a collection view source, it exposes a number of methods and properties we can use to modify the collection it exposes for data binding purposes. First of which is a sort descriptions property. It's a collection of sort descriptions that supports multi-sorting, and we just add new sort description objects into it, telling it what property to sort on and what direction to sort. So just simply by adding that and hooking that up to a button, we can go ahead and run. And we can see I will click on the sort property, and now things are sorted by state. Now there is a slightly different way to go about this, using collection views instead of the collection view source explicitly. So I could comment out the line of code that went directly to the sort descriptions property of the collection view source, and instead use the .view property on the collection view source to get a reference to the iCollectionView interface. We've seen this one in previous demos in an earlier module, and we used it to drive the current object within the collection and to be able to move that cursor, if you will, for the current object forward and backward to select different items in the collection. Well, the collection view is really the thing that knows how to do the sorting, and it really exposes the same API. It has a sort descriptions collection that you can add new sort descriptions into and do the exact same thing that we were doing directly on the sort descriptions here. By doing it through iCollectionView, you're not coupled to whether you're actually using a collection view source or not. I showed in a previous demo, there's always an iCollectionView under the covers you can get to through get default view. So we could sort through that even if we're not using a collection view source. Functionality here is exactly the same. Now another thing I might want to do is filter my data based on some criteria. So I'm going to drop down here and add another button, which will show up at the top called filter, and it's going to target a method we'll add in the code behind called onFilter. I'll drop in the code behind and add that method. And you can see what the API looks like here is, again, we reach out and get a reference to our collection view source. That collection view source has an event on it called filter. And when you hook up a subscriber to that event, it's going to trigger it to reevaluate its collection, fire that event once for each object, and let your event handler decide whether to include that object or not. So you can see the event handler takes in a filter event args. Inside of that event args is an item, which is the data-bound object it's evaluating, and you're expected to return a Boolean through the accepted property of the event arg. So here I'm just inspecting, is the state equal to Alaska? If so, I set accepted to true and it will be presented. Otherwise, I set it to false. So I can go ahead and run this, expand so we can see our states a little better, hit the filter, and now we see only Alaska. Now, of course, the way this is wired up right now, we would be resubscribing each time I click on the button. So you'd want to structure that a little bit differently and do it one time as the view initializes. I just wanted to keep it all local here for demo purposes. Now again, if you go through the collection view, there's a little bit different way to get it hooked up here. So we could get to our collection view source and get to its underlying iCollectionView. And then instead of the event-based model, which I've always kind of hated events where you're expected to set properties on the event args to make things happen by the caller, kind of violates the fire and forget notion of events. So I'm not a big fan of this event-based way of doing it. The iCollectionView way is a little bit more explicit. What you set is a filter property on the view. That filter property is set to a delegate type that's called predicate. Predicate takes in an object and returns a Boolean. And basically the filter predicate will be evaluated once for each object in the collection, anytime you set the filter property or you change the underlying collection. So this is just a little bit more explicit that you pass in an item and you return a Boolean to say yes or no whether you should include it. In this case, I'm doing Arizona instead of Alaska. So with that hooked up, I can run and we'll see the exact same behavior, just for a different state. Click on filter, and now we just have the two Arizona customers. Lastly, through the collection view source, you can do grouping. So I'll add another button in my UI here to group objects, and I'll drop into the code behind and add a handler for that onGroup method. Similar thing, I need to get a reference to my collection view source, and it exposes a group descriptions property. Now this one I'm not going to show, but there is a way to go down through the iCollection view, and it has a group descriptions property as well. Here we just add a new property group description, tell it what property it's based on, and it's going to start grouping based on that property. If we go ahead and run with that, click on group, now we can see the groupings of states over on the right. Now just having them grouped like that may not be enough visual indication, so the data grid and list view controls in WPF support styling based on that group. So I can go back to my XAML here, go up to my data grid, and add a property called group style to the data grid, setting it to a group style instance. And the group style can have various things in it, but one of the things it has is a header template. That's just a data template that you can put whatever you want in it. Now the data context for this is not going to be a row object. It's actually going to be the group itself, which will have its name property set based on the group that it's rendering. So the binding is generally going to be name here. But with that in place, we can go ahead and run again. Click on group. And now we see it puts these bands in here in between the groups and renders out our group style template. Obviously, you could put some better visual structure to that to make it prettier. But that's how you deal with sorting, filtering, and grouping using the collection view source.